The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the pines, carrying with it the biting promise of a blizzard that had been threatening the territory for days. Silver Creek, Montana, in the winter of 1881, was not a place for the weak, nor was it a place for mercy. The town was little more than a jagged scar on the side of a frozen mountain, a collection of timber shacks and canvas tents huddled together against the encroaching white death. The air smelled of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of impending snow. On the porch of the Lucky Nugget Saloon, a crowd had gathered, their breath puffing into the freezing air like steam from a locomotive. They weren't there for gold today, nor for the watered-down whiskey that burned the throat but failed to warm the belly. They were there for a spectacle. Standing on an overturned crate, shivering violently, was My Lin. She was 24 years old, though the hardship of the frontier had etched a weary wisdom into her dark eyes that made her seem older. What made the scene truly grotesque, what made the miners and trappers pause and stare with a mixture of pity and cruel amusement, was her attire. In the dead of a bitter winter, with the temperature dropping well below freezing, My Lin was dressed in a thin, light pink prairie dress. The fabric was practically translucent against the grey backdrop of the town, offering no protection against the wind that whipped her raven-black hair across her face. Her skin, usually a warm olive, was pale and tinged with blue at the lips. She hugged herself, her knuckles white, refusing to meet the gaze of the men who surrounded her. Standing on either side of her were her father, Chen, and her older brother, Wei. They were dressed in heavy wool coats and fur-lined caps, a stark contrast to the shivering woman between them. Chen, a man whose face was a map of deep wrinkles and hardened resolve, looked at his daughter not with love, but with the cold calculation of a merchant inspecting damaged goods. "Look at her," Wei sneered, addressing the crowd. "Useless hands. Too old to marry. Too weak to mine. A mouth that eats but gives nothing back." Chen spat onto the frozen mud. "She is a burden," the old man announced, his voice cracking over the wind. "A cruel joke the spirits played on my house. No sons from her, no dowry for her. We go to the lower valley before the pass closes. She does not come." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. It was a dark, ugly sound. The men of Silver Creek were hard, but selling one's own flesh and blood in the middle of winter, dressed like a doll in a summer storm, was a level of callousness that shocked even them. Yet, none stepped forward. The saloon owner, a greasy giant of a man named Barnaby Rourke, leaned against the doorframe, chewing on a toothpick. "I'll give you $5, Rourke grunted. "She can scrub the floors until she drops. Then the wolves can have her." Wei laughed, a sharp, barking sound. $5 and a bottle of whiskey, and she is yours." My Lin did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears in this frozen hell froze on your cheeks and only brought more pain. She stared at the horizon, where the grey sky met the white peaks, and accepted that this was how she would die. Cold, humiliated, and sold for the price of a drink. Then, the rhythm of the wind was broken by the heavy, rhythmic thud of hoofbeats. The crowd parted, their jeers dying in their throats. A large black stallion, its coat shaggy with winter growth, pushed through the gathered men. The rider was a mountain of a man, sitting easy in the saddle but radiating a tension that made the hair on the back of neck stand up. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat left unbuttoned to reveal a bright red flannel shirt that seemed to burn against the dreary landscape. A dark brown cowboy hat was pulled low over his eyes, shading a face hidden behind a thick, dark beard. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Rourke. His eyes, sharp and blue as a glacial lake, were fixed on My Lin. He pulled the horse to a halt in front of the crate. The beast snorted, blowing distinct plumes of fog into the face of Mai's father. "Transaction closed," Rourke shouted, stepping forward. "Move along, cowboy." The stranger ignored him. He looked at Chen. "You're selling her?" His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder echoing in a canyon. "She is sold," Chen said, clutching the bottle Rourke had just handed him. "Useless girl." "You want her?" "Talk to the fat man." The stranger in the red shirt shifted his gaze to Rourke, then back to the shivering woman in the pink dress. He saw the blue tint of her fingernails, the way her body trembled so violently she could barely stand. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a heavy pouch. He tossed it. It hit Chen's chest with a heavy, metallic thud, knocking the wind out of the old man. "That's gold dust," the stranger said. $50 worth. 10 times what the fat man gave you." Chen's eyes widened. He scrambled to catch the pouch, dropping the whiskey bottle in the mud. "She is yours. Take her." "Hey!" Rourke shouted, his face reddening. "We had a deal." The stranger turned his horse slightly, revealing the Winchester rifle in the scabbard and the heavy Colt on his hip. He rested his hand casually on the pommel, near the gun. "Deal's changed," he said calmly. "Unless you want to argue with the coin." Rourke looked at the size of the man, the calm lethality in his posture, and the heavy pouch in Chen's hand. He spat and stepped back. "Take the baggage. She'll be dead by morning anyway." The stranger turned back to Mai Lin. He didn't command her. He didn't yell. He simply unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat, pulled it off, and held it out. "Come on," he said. Mai Lin hesitated. She looked at her father, who was already counting the gold, not sparing her a glance. She looked at her brother, who was laughing. Then she looked at the stranger. In his eyes, she didn't see the lust or cruelty she saw in Rourke's. She saw something else. Patience. She stepped off the crate, her legs numb. She stumbled, but before she could hit the frozen ground, a strong hand caught her arm. The stranger swung her up behind him on the saddle, then draped the massive coat around her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, smelling of tobacco, pine resin, and horse, but it was warm. It was the warmest thing she had felt in years. "Hold on," he murmured. He spurred the horse, and they rode out of Silver Creek, leaving the jeering crowd, the cruel family, and the impending blizzard behind them. They rode in silence for hours. The snow began to fall, first as gentle flakes, then as driving, stinging pellets. Mai Lin clung to the stranger's waist, her face buried in the rough wool of his red shirt where the coat gaped open. She was terrified. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he was taking her. She only knew that the heat radiating from his back was keeping her alive. The terrain grew steeper, the trees thicker. They were climbing high into the foothills, away from the trails used by miners and drifters. The wind howled through the canyons, a mournful song that seemed to warn them back, but the stranger's horse trudged on, unwavering. By the time they stopped, twilight had turned the world a deep, bruised purple. They were in a small clearing nestled against a sheer rock face that offered some protection from the wind. There was no cabin. No house. Just a three-sided lean-to made of rough logs and canvas, half buried in a drift. The stranger swung down and reached up to help her. Mai Lin's legs gave way when she hit the ground, her muscles frozen stiff. He caught her again, easily lifting her and carrying her into the shelter. He set her down on a pile of furs near the back wall. "Stay put," he said. Mai watched as he worked. He moved with an efficiency that was mesmerizing. Within minutes, he had cleared the snow from the fire pit, shaved dry wood from the heart of a log, and struck a spark. A fire roared to life, pushing back the shadows and the biting cold. He brought in his saddlebags, tended to the horse, and then finally sat down across the fire from her. He pulled a strip of jerky and a tin of beans from his bag. He warmed the beans near the coals, then handed the tin and a spoon to her first. "Eat," he said. Mai Lin took the tin, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken. He nodded, taking a piece of jerky for himself. "Name's Nathaniel." "Nate." "I am Mai Lin," she said softly. "Mai Lin," he repeated, testing the sound. He nodded again. "Well, Mai Lin, this ain't much. The storm came on faster than I thought. I've been hauling logs for a month, meaning to build a proper cabin. Got the timber cut, but the walls aren't up. We'll have to make do with the lean-to for now." Mai looked around the small, open-faced shelter. It was primitive, but the fire was hot, and the furs were thick. "It is better than the street," she said honestly. Nate looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since the saloon. He took in the ridiculous pink dress peeking out from under his coat, the delicate features of her face, the sadness in her eyes. "Why were they selling you?" he asked, his voice rough. Mai lowered her gaze. "My father says I am useless. I am 24. In my culture, and out here. If a woman is not married, she is nothing. I have no skills for the mines. I cannot hunt. I was just another mouth." Nate grunted, poking the fire with a stick. "Nobody is useless. Just gotta find what you're built for." That night, the storm broke in full fury. The wind screamed like a banshee, piling snow against the open side of the lean-to. Nate hung a heavy canvas tarp across the opening, securing it with rocks. It trapped the heat of the fire inside, creating a small, smoky, warm cocoon. Mai curled up in the furs, pulling his coat tight around her. She watched him. He didn't try to touch her. He didn't make lewd comments. He simply laid his bedroll out on the opposite side of the fire, placed his rifle within reach, and tipped his hat over his eyes. "Sleep," he grunted. "I'll keep the fire fed." And for the first time in her life, Mai Lin slept without fear of what the morning would bring. The winter was brutal. For 3 weeks, they were snowed in. The drifts were 6 feet high, turning the clearing into a white prison. But inside the prison, something changed. The first few days, Mai tried to serve him. She tried to wait until he ate, tried to clean his boots, tried to make herself small and obedient, as her father had taught her. Nate put a stop to it on the 3rd day. She had reached for his empty coffee cup to refill it, and he gently caught her wrist. "Stop," he said firmly. Mai flinched, expecting a strike. "I ain't your master, Mai," Nate said, his blue eyes intense. "And you ain't a slave. You want coffee, you pour it. I want coffee, I pour it. We share the work here." He stood up and handed her a spare pair of heavy trousers and a flannel shirt he had dug out of a trunk. "And take that pink dress off. It's ridiculous. You'll freeze to death. Put these on. We got work to do." That was the beginning. Nate didn't just keep her alive, he taught her how to live. When the snow stopped falling, he took her out. He showed her how to walk in snowshoes, lifting her feet high to avoid tripping. He put a small hatchet in her hand and showed her how to split kindling, correcting her grip not with anger, but with patient, quiet instruction. "Let the weight of the head do the work," he said, standing behind her, his voice near her ear. "Don't force it. Guide it." When she finally split a log clean through, a rare smile broke across her face. Nate smiled back, a quick, fleeting expression that disappeared into his beard, but it made her heart hammer in her chest. He taught her to read the signs of the forest. He showed her the difference between wolf tracks and coyote tracks. He taught her how to check the snares he set for rabbits. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside, Mai looked at him. He was carving a piece of cedar, his knife moving with fluid grace. "Why are you alone out here, Nate?" she asked. The knife stopped. Nate stared into the flames for a long time. "I wasn't always," he said quietly. "Had a wife. Clara. And a little girl." Mai's breath caught. "What happened?" "Smallpox. 3 years ago. Took them both in a week." He swallowed hard, the grief still raw in his voice. "After that, I couldn't stand the town. Couldn't stand the noise. Came up here. Figured I'd live alone, die alone. It was simpler." "And now?" Mai asked softly. Nate looked up at her. The firelight danced in his eyes. "Now, it ain't so simple. And I don't mind that it ain't." The connection between them grew like a slow-burning ember. It wasn't spoken of. It was in the way Nate would ensure she had the warmest spot by the fire. It was in the way Mai began to mend his clothes, stitching up tears with careful precision, not because she had to, but because she wanted to care for him. When the weather broke in late February, the real work began. The snow melted enough to expose the timber Nate had felled. "I promised myself a cabin," Nate said, looking at the stack of logs. "You willing to help?" "I am not useless," Mai said, lifting her chin. Nate grinned. "Never said you were." They worked side by side. It was grueling labor. Mai's hands, once soft, grew calloused and strong. She learned to mix the mud for chinking, packing it tight between the logs to seal out the wind. She learned to use the draw knife to peel bark. She hauled stones for the chimney until her back ached, but she never complained. Every ache was a reminder that she was building something. Not for a master, but for herself. For them. By March, the cabin had walls and a roof. It wasn't a mansion, but to Mai, it was a palace. It had a sturdy door, a stone fireplace that drew smoke perfectly, and a loft for sleeping. They moved in on a rainy afternoon. The sound of the rain drumming on the roof was a comfort, signaling that they were safe, dry, and home. But the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. 2 weeks later, the snow had receded enough for horses to travel easily up the mountain trail. Mai was outside, hanging washed clothes on a line, when she heard the riders. Her stomach dropped. She knew that sound. She ran to the porch just as 3 men rode into the clearing. It was Chen, Wei, and a stranger, a man in a sharp suit who looked out of place in the wild. Nate stepped out of the cabin, his rifle in the crook of his arm. He moved in front of Mai, shielding her. "Lost?" Nate asked, his voice cold. Wei sneered, dismounting. "We came to check on our investment. Didn't think she'd survive the winter. Thought we'd find a frozen corpse." "She's alive," Nate said. "Now get off my land." Chen stepped forward. He looked at the sturdy cabin, then at Mai, who looked healthy, strong, and dressed in warm, practical clothes. His eyes narrowed. "This is Mr. Sterling," Chen said, gesturing to the man in the suit. "He is looking for workers for the laundry in Helena. He pays for women. Good money." "I sold her too cheap," Chen continued, looking at Nate. "You got a winter's work out of her. Now we take her back to sell her properly." Mai felt the old fear rising, freezing her blood. But then she looked at Nate's back. The red shirt. The broad shoulders. She remembered the axe in her hand. She remembered the cabin wall she had helped build. "No," Mai said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the air. Chen looked at her, shocked. "What did you say?" Mai stepped out from behind Nate. She stood tall, her hands clenched into fists. "I said no. You sold me. You took the gold. I am not yours anymore. I am not a thing to be traded." Wei laughed and took a step forward, reaching for his belt. "You ungrateful little." A gunshot shattered the silence. Wei froze. A puff of dirt had exploded inches from his boot. Nate hadn't raised the rifle. He had drawn the Colt from his hip with lightning speed. The smoke curled lazily from the barrel. "Next one takes your toe," Nate said calmly. "The one after that takes your knee." Mr. Sterling, the man in the suit, looked pale. He raised his hands. "I was told this was a willing transaction. I want no part of a gunfight." He turned his horse and galloped away. Wei looked at his father, uncertain. Chen's face was twisted with rage, but he looked at Nate's eyes and saw death waiting there. "She is dead to us," Chen spat. "If you keep her, you keep a curse." "I reckon I'm lucky then," Nate drawled. "Now, ride. Before I change my mind about letting you leave." Chen and Wei mounted their horses. They cast one last look of hatred at Mai, then turned and fled down the mountain. Mai stood trembling as they disappeared. The adrenaline faded, leaving her weak. She felt Nate's hand on her shoulder. She turned and buried her face in his chest, sobbing. Not tears of sadness, but of release. You did good, Nate whispered, stroking her hair. You stood tall. They are gone, she asked. They're gone. And they ain't ever coming back. Spring bloomed in the valley. The wildflowers that Mai had planted around the cabin burst into color, blues, yellows, and purples against the green grass. The air was sweet and warm. One afternoon, Nate came back from checking the trap lines. He looked nervous, which was strange for a man who had stared down a blizzard and a loaded gun without flinching. He walked up to Mai, who was sitting on the porch mending a fishing net. He took off his hat and fiddled with the brim. Mai, he started. She looked up, smiling. Yes, Nate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a ring, but not of gold or silver. It was carved from the heart of a cherrywood branch. He had spent hours on it, sanding it until it was smooth as glass, carving tiny vines and flowers into the wood. I ain't got much, Nate said, his voice thick with emotion. I ain't a rich man. I got this cabin, this land, and... well, I got a lot of past I'm trying to leave behind. He knelt on one knee in the dirt. Mai gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. But you, and Nate continued, looking up at her with naked adoration. You saved me, Mai. I thought I was just saving you that day in town, but I was wrong. You brought the life back to this mountain. You brought the life back to me. He held out the wooden ring. Mai Lin, I know your family treated you like a joke. Like you were worth nothing. But to me, you're worth everything. Will you marry me? Be my wife? Partner. Tears streamed down Mai's face, hot and happy. My father said I was useless, she choked out. He said I was too old. He was a fool, Nate said firmly. Yes, Mai whispered. Yes, Nathaniel. I will marry you. He slid the wooden ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply as the sun dipped below the peaks of the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and fire. They were married a week later by a traveling preacher who passed through the valley. There were no guests, no crowd, no jeering drunks. Just the two of them, the mountains, and the endless sky. Mai Lin wore her pink dress one last time, but she had modified it, adding sturdy leather accents and embroidery she had stitched herself. It was no longer a symbol of her weakness, but a testament to her survival. Nate wore his best red shirt and a clean black vest. Years passed. The cabin grew into a ranch. Children's laughter eventually filled the valley, 2 sons and a daughter who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. They faced hard winters, droughts, and lean years, but they faced them together. The people of Silver Creek eventually forgot the girl who was sold for $5, but they knew the woman who ran the Thorn Ranch. They knew her as a woman of steel and grace, a woman who could shoot a wolf at 100 yards and stitch a wound with the gentle hands of a healer. One winter evening, many years later, Mai stood on the porch, watching the snow fall. It was piling up, just as it had on that day so long ago. She rubbed the smooth wood of the ring on her finger, now worn soft by time. Nate stepped out behind her, his beard now streaked with gray. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his warmth. Cold? He asked. No, Mai smiled, leaning into him. I am home. Her family had sold her as a cruel joke, discarding her like trash in the snow. But the joke was on them. For in the arms of the lonely rancher, on the side of a wild mountain, the useless Chinese girl had found a kingdom, a love, and a life worth more than all the gold in Montana.